Studies of Living Science looking at the effects of human activities on species. Thanks to Sam Moyle for producing this PowerPoint. So science understands we're going to look at human activities can create new and significant selection pressures on a gene pool leading to species extinction, describe how these activities have caused or may threaten the extinction of species, give examples of human activities that led to climate or environmental change. So let's talk about the impact of humans in Australia. So the first humans arrived in Australia about 60,000 years ago. This led to changes in existing communities through their actions. So an example of that is the use of fire as a hunting tool. It affected not just one, but it affected many species being present, because they deliberately lit fires favoured plants with hard or minimal leaves, such as sclerophylls, rather than broad-leaved rainforest-type trees. So sclerophyll forest is very common across Australia. It's the kind of gum tree-type forest that we see everywhere. Consequently, the populations dependent on these also change. So if you're getting rid of your broad-leaved rainforest plants, then the populations that depend on the broad-leaved rainforest plants won't be accounted for anymore. So this is just some initial examples of human impacts on Australia. There are many impacts that humans have had in Australia in the last 60,000 years. So how can we know if we're having an impact? Sometimes the influence is obvious. If you clear large tracts of land for agriculture or for housing, for example, removing the producers, and you're probably also removing the consumers, when you clear away all those living things present in that area. You could also introduce a new species, and that leads to often really quick change in an ecosystem that hasn't dealt with that species before. Often our influence is a lot more subtle and insidious. So let's talk about climate change. The presence of carbon dioxide can be measured and has been for many years. We can do things like look at bubbles stuck in ice cores from the Antarctic, and we can measure the amount of carbon dioxide in the bubbles that are present there. The evidence is irrefutable. There's no argument really in scientific circles about it. The amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has increased significantly. So this data only goes back to 2013. I remember around about here is actually, I think, a year later when we kicked over to 400 parts per million for the first time, and then we haven't looked back. It's increasing significantly, and it hasn't leveled out. It isn't leveling out anytime soon. The amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is really, really high compared to historical levels. On this graph, we can see from 1950 to 2013, it's basically a linear increase vertical, which is frightening. So why is the carbon dioxide not good? The rise in carbon dioxide results in overall increase in the Earth's temperature due to the greenhouse effect. So heat in the form of solar radiation enters the Earth's atmosphere. Oftentimes, a lot of the heat energy will be lost back through the atmosphere at night and re-radiated out into space. But greenhouse gases trap that heat energy in the form of infrared energy in the bonds as the atoms inside the molecules bounce around. So that makes it harder for the heat energy to be radiated back out into space. So the heat can't escape. That increases the atmospheric temperature above the Earth. So here's a picture showing the greenhouse effect. Unfortunately, this is in Fahrenheit. 60 degrees Fahrenheit is about 15 degrees Celsius. So with the atmosphere and this mix of greenhouse gases, we get an average daily temperature of about 15 degrees over the surface of the Earth. Without the atmosphere, it's saying here the temperature would be 0 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about minus 18 degrees Celsius or so. So the atmosphere traps heat energy. Now, the issue is we're adding extra greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, and it's not just carbon dioxide, we're also adding methane as well. And methane is a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, but it doesn't last as long in the atmosphere. By adding extra gases in there, it makes it much harder for the heat energy to escape back to space, so the heat energy is trapped at the surface in the atmosphere, and that leads to a lot of consequences. One of those consequences is the melting of the polar ice caps. That will lead to a rise in sea level and an overall change in weather patterns. Polar ice caps, particularly if we're looking at Antarctica, that's ice on top of land, so when that water melts it goes into the sea, and that leads to sea level rise. Thermal expansion of water is another cause of sea level rise. Just extra heat in the atmosphere gets transferred to the ocean, and more heat in water makes it expand, so it gets bigger, so that leads to sea level rise. Getting rid of ice caps, rising sea levels, changing in salinity patterns, they can lead to weather patterns changing as well, and that would have big effects on communities of organisms all around the world. Another example of human activity that causes issues is acid rain. It's mainly a big issue in the northern hemisphere. So acid rain has caused some waterways to become sterile. When we burn a substance like coal, it contains sulfur as an impurity, and that reacts produce sulfur dioxide, which produces sulfur trioxide, which then produces sulfurous and sulfuric acid. And they're floating around in clouds ready to fall out with rain. Whenever you burn anything at a high temperature in Earth's atmosphere, you generate nitrogen oxides of various forms. So nitric oxide, nitrogen dioxide. What happens with those is they react with water in the atmosphere and you produce nitric and nitrous acids. Both of those acids can cause damage. So again, they sit around in clouds and then they fall out with the rain. Acids accumulate in waterways, they lower the pH, and we've seen before how specific pH tolerances are available to organisms, and if you go outside of those pHs, the organisms suffer. Low pHs, particularly very acidic pHs, are going to denature proteins and disrupt cellular activities of organisms and kill them off. Other human activities, we do agriculture. So we get rid of large trees like jarrah, and that causes the water table to rise, and that increases the salinity of the soil. Big trees have deep roots, and they absorb excess water from the soil, and we get transpiration happening, so the water stays low in the soil. If you get rid of those roots, the water tends to move up. It rises up in the water table, and when it does that, it brings salt with it to the surface, and that increases the salinity of soil. So here's a picture showing that. So here we have our nice deep-rooted plants, so the water is staying really, really low. If we get rid of those big deep-rooted plants, the water will start to move its way up the water table, and when it does that, it brings salt with it. And salt isn't particularly good for most plants that haven't adapted to deal with salt because it causes issues with osmosis, and that leads to plants dying. Other things humans do are get rid of mangroves. So mangroves provide a sheltered habitat for species of animal offspring and also protect coastlines from erosion. We're seeing big issues with erosion around Australia now, where we get big rain events or storm events or wind events, and they lead to coastlines being washed away. Mangroves are nurseries. Because they calm down the water coming in from the sea, we have sheltered water, which is good for small things turning into big things. If you clear mangroves, you decrease biodiversity and you increase the erosion of coastline. Now, why are we getting rid of mangroves? Well, they're right near the coast, so they can be nice land that you could sell off to people so they can build their houses close to the beach. Other things that humans have done are we build dams. And when you build a dam, you cause a lot of ecological damage. It gives you a good source of power that's pretty good for the environment in terms of you're not burning something to generate large amounts of electricity, but you are stopping the natural flow of water. So some things that can happen when you build a dam: terrestrial communities become flooded. So upstream of the dam, you have a lot of land that would have been on top of the water becomes suddenly under the water. So what happens to all those organisms that were living on that land? And you also get new aquatic communities taking the place, and that changes the dynamics of those populations. But you don't get flow from above the dam to below the dam unless you have really good designs in your dam for the movement of species from up to down or down to up. So human activities create new significant selection pressures on a gene pool. Let's talk about some species extinctions that have been caused by humans. So fossil evidence suggests that until reasonably recently we had large megafauna present in Australia. This is Diprotodon down here. It's essentially a really big wombat. The reason why Diprotodon and other megafauna may have gone extinct is probably down to climate change, but also an awful lot of human activity, because megafauna overlapped with human populations for around about 20,000 years, at least in Australia. So Diprotodon became extinct around about 25,000 years ago. So we have that overlap between humans. These probably would have been quite a good source of meat since they are herbivores. Humans tend to eat herbivores. There would have been issues with humans probably hunting these. In Australia, we can look at Tasmanian extinctions. So Tasmanian tigers, devils, quolls from the mainland occurred around about 2,000 years ago. That was possibly due to the introduction by humans of dingoes into Australia. Dingoes are only found on the mainland, so Tasmania was a bit of a refuge for Tasmanian tigers, devils, and some quoll species. But a bounty was put on Tasmanian tigers in the late 1800s and early 1900s, so you would get money for hunting a Tasmanian tiger because they might eat your sheep, so let's get rid of them. So they were hounded to extinction. The last one died in about 1930 in a zoo in Hobart. 17 species of Australian mammal have become extinct since European invasion in 1788, and of the 1,600 vertebrate species in Australia, 300 are at risk. So we have the highest rate of mammal extinction on Earth in Australia. Let's talk about the bilby, so a South Australian example. So here are some greater bilbies. They're ridiculously cute. Their job in the ecosystem, or the niche that they fulfill, is similar to that of a rabbit. So they're foraging ground, herbaceous and grassy type species. So they're very numerous in South Australia, and they benefited by the introduction to crops because they would be able to eat the crop plants that were growing. But rabbits were introduced to Australia and foxes were introduced to Australia, and this led to a war on two fronts. The rabbit is competing for resources because they're competing in the same niche, but they can also reproduce a lot faster than bilbies can, and foxes are really good predators. We haven't seen the lesser bilby for a very long time. It's presumed to be extinct. Whereas the greater bilby is found in some isolated areas, and we're doing lots of breeding programs to try and help reintroduce greater bilbies into areas where we've removed things like foxes and rabbits from those areas. So the most famous example of extinction is probably the dodo of Mauritius. So they didn't die out in the Ice Age, so don't believe that movie. The last one died around about 300 years ago. It was also noted that Calvaria major trees also decreased in numbers after the dodos disappeared. So it's probable that the dodo was instrumental in distributing the Calvaria seeds. So it's thought that the seeds needed to pass through the dodo's digestive system in order for the thick wall of the seed to be digested so that the seed could germinate. But there's some arguments around about this. So why did the dodo die out? Sailors arriving in Mauritius brought with them rats, and the rats were really good at eating dodo eggs. So once the rats came in, the dodo eggs were eaten, and dodos didn't reproduce particularly quickly. So producing eggs didn't happen a lot, and basically as soon as the rats came in, they were doomed. So this is another example of introducing invasive species by humans. Cassowary is similarly crucial to the survival of many rainforest trees present in Queensland and also Papua New Guinea. And it's possible the emu is similar for quandongs in South Australia. So they eat seeds, their digestive system breaks down parts of the seeds, the outer wall of the seed, and that can lead to ease of germination once the seed is passed through. So you can think of what would happen if we get rid of these big birds, then we're not going to get that germination happening, and that's going to affect the producers in an ecosystem. Often when humans are trying to do something, they try and do good and it often leads to a bad outcome. We interfere in places that we probably shouldn't. So communities tend to have a natural balance between things like predator and prey. So if you have too many predators, then you run out of prey species. If you don't have enough predators, then your prey species overwhelm the population of other organisms like producers. So an example of this in the US was culling of mountain lions and coyotes. If you get rid of the mountain lions and coyotes, then what they eat tends to start to reproduce in an unfettered manner, so that you have large numbers of their prey species. And they eat plants. So if you get rid of your top predators, then your plants seem to disappear. So this is because this cobab deer, they overgraze the plant populations that were present. And we've done this in Australia. We introduce species to try and make the place look nicer or to remind people of their home countries. And those introduced species competed with native animals for resources. So we have weird cycles where dingoes may kill off stock. So they might kill your sheep and your cows. So if we kill off the dingoes, then kangaroo numbers rise because dingoes also eat kangaroos. And if kangaroo populations increase, then your crops get damaged because the kangaroos are eating the crops. So we get these weird cycles occurring where humans are interfering and their interference causes more problems. In the mid-90s, I remember this, Klesi Virus was accidentally released, and Klesi Virus kills rabbits. So we have a problem with rabbits that have been introduced into Australia. So why not release a virus to get rid of the rabbits? Well, it worked okay because the rabbits died off in huge numbers and vegetation started to come back. But if you have vegetation growing back, then that will lead to whatever eats that vegetation coming back as well. So things like kangaroos will start to reappear, and foxes and feral cats will then go on to eat those kangaroos that come back. An interesting aspect of the release of Klesi Virus is that it led to a drop in wedge-tailed eagle numbers because wedge-tailed eagles like to eat rabbits. So if we get rid of rabbits, then we also get rid of the big, large predator species that were eating the rabbits too. So then we have horrific stories of wedge-tailed eagles trying to eat roadkill, getting hit by trucks and then splattering the drivers of those trucks with the rotting remains of whatever it was they were eating. So with that lovely image in our mind, let's do our check. So human activities create new and significant selection presence on gene pools leading to species extinction. Describe how the activities have caused or may threaten the extinction of species, and give examples of human activities that have led to climate or environmental change. So for Flippin Science, we looked at human activities that affect species. That's it for Flippin Science today. See ya!